All right. Well, hi guys. Thanks for being here. This event is sponsored by Society of Professional Journalists New England chapter. My name's Cassandra Dumay, and I'm the president of the Boston University student chapter for SPJ. I'm here tonight with Samantha Hogan, a former reporter for the Maine Monitor. Before she left the Monitor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Hogan wrote a series of stories on eavesdropping in Maine jails. Her investigation revealed that four jails recorded nearly 1,000 attorney-client calls in a single year, and shared recordings with police prosecutors before trials. She also discovered that defense lawyers were not told when their calls were recorded, and agencies lacked rules about what to do once law enforcement prosecutors eavesdropped on jailed suspects' calls to their attorneys. Hogan was named Maine's Journalist of the Year and won an SPJ Sunshine Award for her efforts. She's here tonight to tell us about how it's all unfolded. Samantha, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and so nice to meet you. I will try not to hold it against you that you attended my sister's university, not mine. Go AU, but BU is a great school, and she had a great time there.
Yeah, awesome. So just to kind of start off a little bit, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you initially got into journalism?
Yeah, so I attended American University, and I actually have a bachelor's degree in print journalism as well as a master's degree in investigative journalism from there. And I fell into journalism out of a love of writing and telling people's stories. And I've been really lucky to be able to do investigative journalism and to do it for 4.5 years at the Maine Monitor, which is a nonprofit newsroom in Maine, and now as part of the investigative team at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is a much larger paper down in Atlanta, Georgia. I just moved here in January. I will say it got up to 78 degrees today in early March, so
I'm
spring is
jealous.
definitely here. But I had a fantastic time reporting in Maine for those 4.5 years, and I spent a significant amount of time working on the jail series, which I was reporting on for 30 months. It made over 100 public records requests to our sheriff's offices to try and get call logs, contracts, inmate handbooks, jail phone policies, receipts for money that they were actually receiving for having these phone systems in the jail. So they were actually getting, thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars back on a monthly basis for people paying to use the phone systems, which I uncovered had been also recording confidential attorney-client phone calls and had been releasing those. So that's a little bit about me. My cat item might make an appearance, but
Well, your cat's welcome.
yes,
How did
always.
you wind up working at the Maine Monitor? And I'm wondering kind of how is reporting on a state like Maine different than covering kind of big metropolitan cities like Atlanta currently, or your work in Washington when you interned at the Post?
So I ended up in Maine through Report for America, which is a national service program for early and mid-career journalists, where they partner up with host newsrooms. So they partnered up with the Maine Monitor to place journalists to cover beats that have not historically been covered or are not being covered well in that area. And so I went in with a general government accountability beat, and I very quickly started working on a series of articles about Maine being the only state in the country that had no public defenders. We relied completely on court-appointed private attorneys that were contracted with the state. And I had found out very quickly that a large percentage of those attorneys had serious professional misconduct adjudicated against them prior to becoming public defense lawyers. And so I was working on that when I was in a public meeting and heard kind of a nonchalant, offhand comment made that the agency that was supposed to be overseeing these contracted public defense lawyers had become aware that there was a recording of an attorney-client phone call, and that the defense lawyer had been notified by the Attorney General's office. They were on the eve of trial, and essentially part of the phone call had been heard. And that poses a real big problem for prosecutors and for the defense. So that case ended up settling. The guy ended up taking a plea deal. But I guess what you do as a reporter is the same whether you're in Augusta, where I think there's like a couple tens of thousands of people, in versus Metro Atlanta, where there's 6 million people in the surrounding counties in the city area. So it's about identifying something that it's like a very clear problem and going after public officials and getting the records and getting the data and listening to people that might historically have been silenced and have not had an opportunity to share their stories. Because I think one of the most disturbing things that I found out in the process of reporting this was that this was a well-documented and to a degree a well-known problem. I found court records going back to 2014 where defense lawyers were finding out that jails had recorded their phone calls and had released those to either police or to prosecutors, and then they were trying to figure out what to do. But because the state had no centralized public defense agency, there was no agency to then go out and actually try to systemically fix this. And so it was just another hole and gap that had been left by the lack of a system. That's a long way of saying that these holes and these gaps exist, whether you're in rural Maine or if you're in Metro Atlanta. And I mean, I'm like less than 2 months into the job out here, and I'm already finding it. You find these holes everywhere, and I think that's the power of journalism, and the reason that we should have sunshine laws and public record laws, and so we can reveal these things.
Yeah. And so how did you kind of approach the story as an early career journalist? And was there stuff that you were kind of learning along the way?
Yeah, so I was really lucky that the Report for America had decided to link up with the Investigative Editing Corps, which is a new project being led by Rose Ciota, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter and editor. And her organization came in. She essentially got to mentor me and walk me through how to do this investigation. And we worked really closely together for far longer than she thought we were going to see this story to fruition. I think, like, again, like, reporting is the same regardless of where you are, how you do it. It's finding the facts, it's verifying it, it's interviews, it's listening, it's questioning, and then writing and then sharing it. So I was really blessed to have Rose's support and guidance throughout this and that partnership. And then we also had support from the International Women's Media Foundation and the Pulitzer Center as well to give me the time to actually step away from my other duties at the Maine Monitor and really focus on getting this reported and done.
So you were able to document the state's history of eavesdropping through interviews with 36 attorneys, defendants, sheriffs, legal experts, hundreds of pages of court records, government emails, data, and like you mentioned, 100 public records requests. What specific documents were you looking for and public records requested, and how difficult was it to get them?
Yeah, so all 100 of those public records requests were not successful. And so there are 16 sheriff's departments in Maine because there are 16 counties. There are only 15 jails because 2 counties do share one regional jail. But essentially every single time I wanted one document, I had to multiply it by 15 or 16. And so I was getting each county's contract there are very large companies that provide inmate phone services. So Securus Technologies is one of the largest in the country, as is GTL, which both are utilized in Maine. Securus has contracts with the vast majority of the jails. And so we wanted their contracts. We wanted to know what they were presenting as the capabilities, what were the limitations of the technology, who was going to be liable for different things. We also looked at bid documents. Those were very helpful to know what they were kind of pitching as the absolute limits of what their technology could do. I got handbooks from almost every jail that are handed out to the people when they arrive at jail. So what were they being told about their right to privacy with attorneys? And we often found that there was contradictions between what was written and what was actually happening. I got usernames of one of the things that we really wanted to do was figure out who was actually potentially listening to these phone calls. So there is an audit trail essentially that exists within the Securus system that shows which individual user clicked on a call and what they did with it. Did they burn it to a CD? Did they download it? Did they play it back, which is their term for listening? So we wanted to do that. And then we just were getting general call logs as well, essentially seeing like who was being called. And that's how we were able to identify the attorneys who were recorded. And for me, it was really important that when we did identify who was being recorded, information as public as possible. So what we did is we created a public-facing database with the name of the defendants along with the attorney that we identified that phone number belonging to, so that there wasn't this continued mystery about was my phone call recorded and was I potentially listened to before my trial. People could actually go and look at that. So we did put all it's obviously not the recordings itself. I never wanted those. I do believe that people have privilege and have the right to confidentiality with their attorneys, but just for clarity about whether or not these people had been recorded. Yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying that's what we were looking at. Yeah.
And so how did you kind of stay organized with keeping track of all these different requests? And also I'm curious too, like once you've got those documents and you're comparing and contrasting what they're actually saying, how did you keep all of that straight?
So I am a big proponent of spreadsheets, and every time I made a request, I was writing out what the name of the request was, who I had sent it to, what date I had sent it, I was mandated to get a 5-day response from the government agencies about whether they were going to deny it or whether they were going to supply the records. When could I expect that? I made notes about when I had followed up with people. And so I had a big tracking document that I tried to keep track of all 100 requests in. I do that in general. Every job that I work, I create this like status log that I just track what my success rate has been and whether I've received records from different agencies. So I did that, and a lot of the actual data it was a small enough volume that we were able to do that in Excel. We did have to go to IRE, investigative reporters and editors. One time we were given a large dump of data across multiple spreadsheets, and I just did not have a SQL server that was able to do the analysis that we needed to do, but they were very able to do that for us. So we did have to outsource that one time, which was great. Great resource for journalists and for newsrooms that maybe don't have a data team. And yeah, and then, I mean, I do remember at one point I looked like a conspiracy theorist a little bit, where I just lined everything up in chronological order in my living room during the pandemic. And I just visually laid out a timeline of how when different agencies had become aware of this issue and when it had cropped up in court records, and just laying it out there in front of myself, I was able to the story kind of wrote itself from there.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit more about that support you're getting from IRE? If journalists are looking for help like that, how
Yeah.
can they reach out and what kind of help can they get?
Yeah. So IRE offers data assistance. It does come at a cost, and it's an hourly rate. But essentially, if you're a member of IRE, which I strongly support students doing that, they have a great student discount rate, and you get a discounted rate to attend their conference, which is so helpful. And then also they have all these tip sheets and just a wonderful network of investigative journalists. So I've been a longtime member of IRE, and I love their support. But they specifically have a data team that I believe is based out of Mizzou University. And they essentially you write out a pitch of what you need help with, and they respond with whether or not they can, run the SQL for you. I think they also maybe do Java, maybe some R. So any kind of statistical or data analysis that you need off of a data set that you have that you just don't have the skills or you don't have the hardware to run it on, they will do that for a fee. Our request was very small. It was going to take me weeks to do my way, and I think they did it in 15 minutes, so it was worth it was worth it. I think they did it like right after lunch. So yeah, they're a great resource. And if you just Google IRE data assistance, it comes up and it's a form you fill out, and they're very responsive.
That's great to know. I have a question in the chat as well, asking what was the hardest part for you about reporting this series?
I mean, I was being gaslit by state officials pretty much from the beginning. I was being told I had written one article about it, and thank you for drawing attention to it, but I don't know why you're continuing to look into this. And when a high up official tells you that, like, keep going, keep looking a little bit deeper, because the volume of what we uncovered was so much more than what that first article had found. And so, I mean, it was not isolated to one case. This was not one recording. This was nearly 1,000 recordings. And I eventually ended up, jails were denying that they were recording attorney-client phone calls. And at the end of the day, like, we found Androscoggin, Aroostook, Franklin, Kennebec, Penobscot, York, Cumberland, Piscataquis, Somerset, and Two Bridges Regional Jail at different points had all, I think that's 10, and there's only 15 jails. And so, and that was with people, fighting us on releasing this information. I mean, we took York County to court because they just denied basically every public records request. I think they may have given us contracts and money stuff, but they would not tell us what calls they had recorded. And it took 2 years, but we won our lawsuit, and they had to hand over the data to us. And I cried reading the judge's decision, because it was what we had been saying all along, that these were public records and that the public had a right to know if there was this infringement on this very fundamental right, which is the right for someone who's being held incarcerated to privately communicate with their attorney. And so I just remember I cried multiple times reading the decision in our favor. And I felt very vindicated. And it just made all those times that people tried to tell me that there was no story, it just like proved that all the work over those 30 months had absolutely been worth it.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question, was can you tell us a little bit about the process of going to court over these public records?
Yeah. So, I mean, remember, I found out about this in 2020. I think April of 2020. So I was at home. Zoom wasn't even really a thing. People were doing phone conferences because we didn't know how to virtually gather in spaces yet. And I mean, it was a major issue because I was trying to get court records for different articles that I was writing, and courts were physically shutting down, and Maine has no online court records. It's paper or nothing. And so the court process, we were really lucky that Sig Schutz, who is an amazing resource, he's a lawyer in Maine. He's been very generous with the Maine Monitor with his time, and he has a strong passion for First Amendment rights and for the press. And he has represented many Maine newspapers in many important cases. And so he was local counsel. And then the Yale Law School has the Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic, Mafia. And they generously gave us student time, and the clinic directors helped, and they wrote us an amazing brief, and they did a lot of really good legal research. And it was the slowest part of the process was getting a court date. That was like the one issue that we couldn't do. It was just the courts had shut down. There were other cases in front of us. And so, I mean, it was like a random day in the middle of the summer in 2023, I think. Yeah. Yeah. And we finally got our day in court, and both sides argued it really well, and she sided with us. So it was a good day for journalism and for the public.
Yeah, awesome. And another question in the chat is, had you ever worked on an investigation that took that long or it encompassed so much previously?
So no, that's my record holder right now. But I have been lucky to have many months to work on several projects. So I was part of the ProPublica Local Reporting Network. I saw that you are one of ProPublica's uh, rising stars. And so I was part of the local reporting network in 2020. I got a write about indigent public defense. I worked on that for a little over a year. Honestly, at night, I was then writing public records requests for this series, for the jail series. And then I spent like another, I think like 9 months to a year working on a probate series. That was my last big project at the Maine Monitor. So it is the title. Yeah. A lot happens in 30 months. A lot of life happens, but luckily it was a pandemic. So I had plenty of time inside.
Yeah. And so what would your advice be to journalists who are kind of new to public records requesting or are looking to utilize them more effectively in their reporting?
So I think the best thing that you can do for yourself is to just sit down and read your state's law. Every single public records law is different, and there's rules that are unique to each state. So in Maine, at least it was as of December, they had 5 business days to respond to you to tell you whether or not they were going to give you the records, or and then they had absolutely no timeline to actually provide you those records, which is a downside to Maine's law. They also set the cost that they're allowed to charge you per hour to produce those records. It also outlines that they have to give you records in native format, which was really great because that meant I got Excel spreadsheets rather than PDFs of Excel spreadsheets, and we could cite that. And so there's so many tips and tricks that you can learn just by reading your state's own law. And so I would really start there. And there's a lot of really great online resources. I am sure SPJ has some resources online about how to write a public records request, but Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press has sample letters. There's a ton of other great organizations for the press and for the public that tell you how to make these requests. And quite frankly, it doesn't have to be that formal. Not you. It's great if you can cite the code, but if you say that you are making an open records request in an email to the right person, and those people are usually posted online as the public information officer or the person to send open records requests to, and you describe in a certain amount of detail what you're looking for, they have a legal responsibility to respond to that in a good faith way. And so you don't need to be a journalist in order to access records. There are also just great online resources for a lot of the records you might be looking for: land records, court records in some states, just other interesting things that are already out there on the internet that don't even require you to go and make a public records request. But knowing what your rights are is a good place to start. And so I just always sit down, read the public records law.
And so what's it like? You mentioned kind of getting gaslit by officials. What's it like
Yeah.
to be, again, kind of an early career journalist and coming up against that? And how did you maintain confidence in your story? Was it relying on the facts? Was it having support from your editor, a mix of those things, or other things that were helping you?
Yeah, having a really supportive editor is always a great thing. But I also remind myself in every project, like, just remember what made you initially angry. Like, what shocked you to your core so much that you wanted to spend multiple months looking into something? And I was just flabbergasted that the call had been recorded, and that it had made its all the way up to the Attorney General's office prior to trial and had been partially listened to. And so, my brain immediately was going to, well, how many other times had this happened? And so I totally got why lawyers were worried about, okay, can we delete these recordings? Well, before you delete the records, I want to know how pervasive this is. And I think that's the really important role that journalists can play. It's not just a public official saying, oh, we absolutely don't do this. It's like, okay, well, show me the records. There should be no record of you ever recording an attorney-client phone call if you're not doing it. And of course, when we got the records, it showed that they were. And so it's so important for us to be fact checkers on public officials, for us to maybe even shine light on a problem that people don't fully grasp how big of a problem it is. And just believing in yourself and continue to do that reporting process and to continue to just try. It was so much more important that these individuals who were affected had a chance to have their story told thoughtfully than it was like whether or not someone in the Attorney General's office liked me. Like, I personally think, like, I'm not here to make friends with the people that I'm supposed to be covering. And that's very freeing, because if you don't care per se what you like, I'm a good person and I want them to think of me as a ethical journalist and a good journalist. But whether or not you personally like what I'm reporting on doesn't matter to me. And I think that's really freeing. Like, we just do good reporting and let that speak for itself.
Yeah, awesome. That's great advice, especially for somebody like me that's starting off. It can be hard to be in like confrontational
And always
situations with
be nice,
people.
like always be nice. Like, I was never not nice about it, but you're not going to please the people when you're writing like important stories. Like, a lot of defense lawyers didn't like me when I wrote about indigent public defense. A lot of prosecutors didn't like me when I wrote about the jail phone call recordings. And so you could be the same person and like have people like and dislike you. It's just the topic. It's just the topic. And I thought both of those were really important.
And another question from the chat is, one of your stories was about the Maine governor's remarks that lawyers were reckless and should have made sure that they weren't being recorded. What was it like to have the governor respond to your series? And was it possible for lawyers to even know if they were being recorded?
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to have sat down with Governor Mills for this series. I put in so many requests to her office to have that conversation, to get on a phone call. Her staff did take written questions and respond. But I got denied every single time to sit down with her. Janet Mills is the former Attorney General of the state of Maine. She knows this issue inside and out. She also used to be a defense lawyer. She has literally seen this from every single angle, and it was disappointing to not get to have a frank conversation with her about what I had uncovered. However, I mean, I think it is important, like, at the end of the day, she holds a lot of sway over the policies and the laws that get passed in the state. She's a very talented politician. And so I think it was necessary for us to include her in the conversation as much as we could. And I will say that, I mean, it's complicated, right? Like, the process was very unclear about how attorneys could get their phone number exempted. And they thought sometimes if they did it at one jail, if they all used Securus, then they thought they were being exempted across all the jails. And that just wasn't true, that you had to individually, like, so if you were a lawyer in Cumberland County in Portland, and you also had clients in Androscoggin or in Franklin, you had to exempt your phone number in all those jails. And that just was not clear. It just was not clear. People move law firms, people change phone numbers, people get different cell phones. And so there was definitely error made on the part of the defense lawyers. But I will go back to that there were so many recordings and then several instances where calls had been played back where the lawyer wasn't notified. I was the first person coming to them and saying, I found you in this jail's data. This is what I know. This is the client. This is the date. And I got a lot of appreciation back from defense lawyers saying, thank you for telling me. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, that that these calls were recorded or that anything was done with them. So I do think that there is more work that needed to be done by the sheriffs, by the jail administrators, by the prosecutors, in order, you couldn't just place all the blame on defense lawyers for this happening.
And so in 2023, you wrote kind of a follow-up about changes to the jail system after your initial reporting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so initially a law was proposed that would have made it a felony, would have levied a $10,000 fine. It would have excluded prosecutors and investigators who heard phone calls from continuing to be a part of the investigation. That bill died. And it got turned into a study group instead. And it became a really actually productive conversation. They got the Department of Corrections, they got Sheriff's Associations, they got the ACLU, they got Maine Prosecutors Association, Indigent Public Defense. They all got in a room together and they came up with a law, what eventually became a law that they could all get behind. And at the end of the day, that was the consensus that lawmakers were looking for and felt like they could not get done in the short window of time that they had during that short legislative session. And so what ended up happening is it's not a crime to do this. You're not allowed to record and you're not allowed to listen to these calls. But essentially they have made it much stricter about investigators and prosecutors continuing to be involved in cases after there's been this breach of attorney-client privilege. And that was a big sticking point for a lot of the men that I spoke to whose calls had been listened to. Like there were investigators who heard sometimes more than one call and then continued to investigate a case. And we could get into the fruit of the poisonous tree and all this tainted evidence. Ultimately, none of that has panned out so far in any case. Judges have allowed these investigators to continue to be a part of it, but the legislature has said now, we are going to be more firm about this. This is our expectation. The Prosecutors Association was supposed to finally put policies on paper about how to handle this, and that was a major thing that we had also found, that there's just it was very informal and everyone just, oh, it's understood. Okay, well, let's put it on paper. So they're supposed to be doing that. If there are any Maine journalists that want to follow up on that, they had not done it by the time I left. I think that's important to ensure that that really does go into effect. And then they did make a much clearer process at the jails for lawyers to get their phone numbers exempted from being recorded. So at the end of the day, I think it really ticked a lot of the important boxes that needed to happen for Maine to have a more secure system for people in jail to communicate with their lawyers.
And we have one more question from the chat, and then I'll have a question. What are the differences between public records laws in Maine and Atlanta? And where is it easier to get records and why for you?
Oh, interesting. I'm still learning. I'm still learning Atlanta's Georgia's public records law. The window for them to respond is a little shorter. It's instead of 5 days, it's 3 days. And my understanding is that they're actually supposed to provide those records within 3 days. It's not just a yes, no, they're supposed to provide. I'm already finding that that is not perfect, that is not absolutely adhered to, but it's a nice concept. It's more expensive. They're allowed to charge you more money faster. I think you get 15 minutes free here in Georgia, and in Maine, you got 2 hours free. So, yeah, but time will tell. Every state's laws are quirky, and you just kind of figure out how to work within that regime. Yeah, that's what's coming to mind so far.
Yeah, and how many records have you requested so far in Atlanta?
I think I've made 3 requests so far in my first month, and we're going to make some pretty big ones. But I was like a solo pilot in Maine. If I wanted to make a public records request, it was me. If I wanted data, it was going to be me that was going to be analyzing it. So I'm working on a much bigger team here in Atlanta. And then we also have a whole data team of journalists that are incredibly talented. So if I want a really big database, not just a spreadsheet, if I want a database, they know how to analyze it. So that's daunting and freeing at the same time, which is cool.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution right now?
I'm so sorry. I think my computer might have freeze.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, I'm so sorry. My computer froze for 1 second.
Can you hear me now?
I can. I can, but my internet just got weird. I apologize.
It might be my internet as well. But my final question was just, can you tell
I
us a
think we're
little
better
bit?
now. Yes.
Yeah, I can
No.
hear you. I just sent my final question in the chat. But it's just like, what are you working on right now for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution?
So the first article that I ended up writing was about Georgia's very high maternal mortality rate. And so I don't want to call it the pleasure, but I had the privilege of interviewing a father who 7 months ago lost his wife after she gave birth, and they have 2 young daughters that have been left behind, and really looked at a decade of how Georgia has tried to tackle the issue of maternal mortality. Like many states, it struggles with a very high maternal mortality rate. And Georgia uniquely is one of the last few states that has not fully expanded Medicaid. And so that means that there are coverage gaps. And if women aren't healthy prior to becoming pregnant, they can have more adverse outcomes. And so we looked at that. There was rumor that the Georgia legislature was going to consider a full Medicaid expansion. That has not so far come to fruition, and the legislative session is coming to an end. But I think it was an important piece to do. And then more broadly, I am going to be, looking at other forms of government corruption. I think that's where my sweet spot is. I love doing these kind of system stories, and it exists in every single state. And so I am looking at some government agencies right now and looking at misconduct, looking at settlements, looking at outcomes. I can't talk much more about it other than that. But there's a lot going on here in Atlanta.
Yeah, it sounds like you're doing really important work, and I look forward to reading it once it comes out. I think that's kind of all we have for tonight. Thank you guys so much, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, Samantha.
Thanks so much, Cassandra. It was great to meet you all, and I was so happy to be a part of your Sunshine Week. Okay.
Awesome. Happy Sunshine Week, everyone. Bye-bye.